Good morning. It's James Moran here from GSM Association. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm not getting any feedback. I presume that I am online and that you can see the slides and the video. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, my name is James Moran. I'm Head of Security at the GSM Association. And this morning, what I plan to do is provide an introduction to the Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme, or NESAS, as it's called, which is a mobile industry initiative to address security concerns pertaining to the supply of network equipment, 5G in particular. So this is a supply chain security initiative. So what might be useful is just to kick off with a brief introduction to what supply chain security is and why it's important. The supply chain itself, of course, is a chain of all the individuals, organizations, resources, etc., that are involved in product or service development and the life cycle of those products and services. So that's a pretty universally accepted definition of supply chain, and that's the remit that we're looking at. In terms of supply chain security, this is obviously the part of the supply chain management that's focused on minimizing risk for a variety of stakeholders throughout the supply chain itself. We recognize the fact that supply chain security needs to take into account a variety of threats, both cybersecurity and physical, and we'll see how NESAS addresses some of those issues later on. We also recognize the fact that the volume and complexity of threats is increasing, particularly with increased activity from hackers, from nation states, etc. We also recognize that the motivation of some of the attackers can vary widely, depending on the nature of the attacker and their stated objectives. So, for example, it may be a desire to monitor activity, it might be to steal data, it might be to destroy data, deny service, etc. And we therefore need to take a risk-based approach to what it is we're doing here with network equipment security. We have seen increasingly, unfortunately, over the past 18 months in particular, how supply chain can be leveraged by attackers as a means to gain a foothold and to mount attacks against targets. So subcontractors, contractors, and suppliers throughout the entire supply system are under constant attack. And we've seen some very, very famous and publicized incidents that have happened in recent years. So why is supply chain security important? Well, first of all, it provides an opportunity, of course, for the vendors that do security quite well to demonstrate their ability to achieve and maintain security levels. We're conscious of the fact, particularly as we head towards the introduction of 5G, that there will be increased societal and business reliance on 5G networks and services in particular. Consequently, regulatory interest in this area has increased significantly, and there is increasing pressure being brought to bear on industry and all stakeholders on enhancing security levels. We're also conscious of the fact that the supply chain itself is becoming longer, broader, much more complex. Similarly, the complexity of 5G networks, mobile networks adopting 5G that is increasing significantly as well, with new architectures, components, functions, business relationships, and so forth. We also have recognized that nation-state intelligence gathering is an increasing concern for the industry and for the mobile network operators and their customers. And we are, at the back of our minds, conscious of the fact that we need to maintain consumer trust, and we recognize the danger that security breaches pose to that trust. So there are many different dimensions to supply chain security. Some are legal, some are policy related, and some are technical. The Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme that I'm going to present today is primarily focused on the technical aspects, but we do touch some of the legal and policy aspects too, and hopefully I'll be able to illustrate that as we go through the presentation. In terms of the product development lifecycle, this is just a very simple depiction of it. So at the top we've got the operator. The operator obviously designs and architects the network. They deploy products, they operate those products, and they decommission those products. Then on the vendor side, the vendors design, develop, deliver, maintain, and bring to end of life their product portfolios and their network products. NESAS, which I'm going to present, is focused entirely on the vendor aspect, so it doesn't touch on what the operators do and their responsibilities. That's dealt with separately within GSMA. So the focus of this presentation is very much on the vendor processes, and that's what's in scope. We also, of course, recognize that product development is not the only element of supply chain, but it is one of the more important. So why we need security assurance? As I mentioned already, there will be an increased reliance on 5G networks and 5G services. So therefore, mobile networks are being classified in most countries now as critical national infrastructure. So the security of those networks need to be robust and reliable. We're seeing that some nation states are beginning to regulate and restrict mobile network equipment supply. We recognize the fact that there are security requirements and conformance obligations emerging in some countries, and that is creating a risk of fragmentation. So we've different countries taking different approaches, defining different requirements, and not all of those requirements are consistent, which makes it very, very difficult for the vendor community to satisfy these diverse requirements. So we're seeking to avoid fragmentation. Also recognizing that isolated initiatives in individual countries, while it does introduce complexity for the vendor community, it doesn't necessarily demonstrably improve security levels. So why NESAS? Well, it's quite simple. What we've identified is the need for stakeholders, particularly the equipment vendors and their customers, network operators, to have a commonly agreed set of security assurance requirements. And that's essentially what NESAS is trying to achieve. It does that in two ways. Essentially, NESAS provides a baseline to evidence the fact that network equipment that's being provided to network operators has been developed in accordance with good, secure standards and design practices, and also the fact that the network equipment itself satisfies security requirements that are similarly defined by industry. And it achieves this by doing two things. First of all, it looks at the processes that are used by the vendor to develop and support services and equipment, and then it looks specifically at the equipment products themselves. And we'll see how this plays out shortly. NESAS itself is a collaborative effort between 3GPP, which is the global standards body for mobile, specifically for 5G. And basically 3GPP's role in this is that 3GPP defines the security requirements that the network products must meet, and it defines the test cases that are used to evidence compliance with those requirements. Those requirements are defined in documents that are called Security Assurance Specifications, or SCAS documents. For our part of the GSMA, we have responsibility for the operational aspects of NESAS, so we define the methodologies and the vendor process security requirements, and we also appoint the auditors to carry out the process assessments, and we maintain a list of the test labs that are eligible and qualified to perform the product evaluations. So, without further ado, let me take you through what NESAS looks like, what it covers, and then we can move on perhaps after that to providing you with an update in terms of where we are with NESAS development right now. So in terms of the overview, there are three distinct elements to NESAS. The first one is where we conduct security assessments of the equipment vendors' development and product lifecycle processes. That's to ensure that the development process itself and the support throughout the lifetime of the particular product is done in a secure manner. The second element is where we accredit security test labs to carry out product evaluations. And that's all done in accordance with ISO IEC 17025. So we're reusing a lot of what's already tried and tested in this space. And the third element are the product evaluations themselves. And this is the work that's done by the test labs that are considered competent, using the security requirements and test cases that are defined by 3GPP, as I mentioned earlier. So we'll go through each of those three elements in a little more detail. So the first one is the vendor processes assessment. And there are a number of steps involved here. So obviously we've got on the left-hand side the equipment vendor that defines its security-related processes. These are all documented. Those documents are maintained and updated as regularly as is necessary by the vendor. The vendor, when expressing a desire to be audited and have its processes audited, completes a conformance claim. This is a self-assessment exercise. The conformance claim basically is designed to allow the vendor to carry out its own assessment of how it complies with the security requirements that are defined and how it evidences those, and it lodges a formal conformity declaration to the GSM Association. After that particular point, the GSM Association has retained auditing companies to actually go and properly assess and audit the development processes themselves within the vendor. So the independent audit team carries out that work. That's the step 2 here. And then finally, step 3 is basically where the audit team produces an audit report that's agreed with the equipment vendor, and a copy is supplied to the GSM Association, after which, if the equipment vendor is deemed to have complied with the security requirements, they will be listed on our website as being a competent and participating supplier. It's important to note that this is a first step in the process, and as it says down here in the bottom right hand corner, the process assessment is prerequisite for actually having a product evaluation conducted, as we'll see later. In terms of the development and lifecycle requirements, these are the requirements that are audited during this particular process assessment. These are defined by GSMA and they're documented in FS16. I'll talk more about those documents later on, but we did this using a threat-based approach. So firstly, we identified the assets, and the assets are basically categorized into a number of different areas, so including source code, software packages, finished products, security documentation, operated products, and development support systems. So all of the assets are identified there. Then we identified a number of threats that could apply to those assets. There are 16 of those that have been defined in FS16 at a high level. Then we defined our security objectives, and there are 15 of those. And then finally, we defined the requirements. And there are 20 requirements, again, across a number of different areas, including design, coding, compilation, testing, release, operation, and more general. So these are the security requirements that the auditors use to check on the competency and compliance of the vendor and their processes in terms of developing product. The second element of NESAS that I mentioned earlier is test lab accreditation. And again, we were anxious to avoid reinventing the wheel, so to speak. So what we've done is we have recognized that ISO 17025 accredited test labs are in the main eligible and competent to perform NESAS security product evaluations. There are a number of additional requirements which we'll cover on the next slide, but basically it's up to each individual security test lab to illustrate and demonstrate to their national accreditation body that they have the ability to conduct these tests, so that they have the proper test procedures, adequate and appropriate equipment, capabilities, and expertise. So the diagram basically here is illustrating that the GSMA defines NESAS, 3GPP defines the security assurance specifications, and these are the two things that are used by the accredited test labs to perform the product evaluations themselves. The accreditation body itself may work with subject matter experts if they don't have the necessary expertise in-house to assess whether or not a candidate test lab is competent to perform this testing. And for that reason, we have identified a number of specific requirements that each competent test lab must meet. The overriding one, as I mentioned, is that the test lab must be ISO 17025 accredited. But there are some additional requirements that we have also defined. So in order to demonstrate competency to undertake these product evaluations, the test lab must be able to demonstrate that it fully understands and comprehends the principles and the methods that are used in NESAS, that it understands the relationship between the 3GPP defined security assurance specification documents and the scheme itself. They must be able to demonstrate an overall understanding of the evaluation planning process. They must demonstrate competency to analyze the results of the testing that's performed against the security assurance specifications. They must demonstrate their ability to evaluate products and product development in accordance with the audited process, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later on. Also, obviously, have a capability to document the results properly and to ensure that the test results can be reproduced if necessary. Also, they must understand the required inputs that are necessary for a product evaluation to be conducted, the actual security requirements that are defined within the security assurance specifications, and which SCAS documents apply to which network products. As we'll see, there are quite a number of them, and I'll demonstrate that later on. And finally, of course, it's important that the test lab has a familiarity with knowledge of telecoms equipment generally, how mobile networks are architected, and the interfaces that apply. So these are the competency requirements that a test lab must demonstrate. And the third process is basically the product and evidence evaluation. This is the work that's done by the test lab. So again, we've got a number of steps that apply here. So first of all, obviously, we've got the network product, which the vendor has produced. And that particular product is obviously developed in accordance with a defined process. As far as NESAS is concerned, if there is a product submitted for evaluation, it must have been developed in accordance with a process that has already been assessed and audited by the independent auditors. Again, there is a compliance declaration that is completed by the vendor, which demonstrates how the vendor believes its network product satisfies the security requirements defined by 3GPP, and they lodge that compliance declaration with the GSM Association. Then they engage the services of a test lab. They're free to choose any test lab that's considered competent and listed by GSMA. And then the test lab evaluates the compliance evidence. In other words, it essentially looks for evidence that the product that has been submitted for evaluation has in fact been developed in accordance with a previously audited development process. And of course, the third element is where the product itself is then subjected to a rigorous security evaluation against the security requirements defined by 3GPP. Incidentally, in order for a product to be considered compliant, it must satisfy all of the security requirements, not just most. Okay, so there are the various steps involved. The 3GPP security assurance specifications documents, as I mentioned, there are a number of them. The biggest and broadest is the second one on the list here, 33117, which is a very comprehensive list of general security assurance requirements that applies to all network products. But then, as you'll see, there are individual specifications that apply to individual network functions. So, for example, 33216 is the security specification for E Node B equipment, in the same way that 33511 applies to G Node B equipment. So this is the current list of network functions for which security assurance specifications currently exist. And bear in mind that this is an ongoing process within 3GPP, where clearly new security requirements get added to these documents when the need arises. But also there are new security assurance specifications being defined all of the time to cover other network functions. And we hope that that will continue into the future. So where are we with NESAS right now? Well, first of all, I should say that from the outset, we realized that this is a living scheme and that there is a need for continuous improvement. So we're constantly assessing the success of the scheme. We're defining the requirements and changes that need to be made. They're included in various releases. And of course, we have a feedback loop that we constantly monitor, getting feedback from the participating vendors, from their network operator customers, from the auditors that are assessing the product development processes, and of course from the test labs that are conducting the product evaluations. Right now we're on NESAS 2.0. That was released in December 2020. The first release of NESAS had been in October 2019. We had an interim release in September 20. We're currently finalizing NESAS 2.1. Those documents will be published in the next few weeks. So this just illustrates that it's an ongoing process of improvement. We're learning all the time, and we're hopefully improving the scheme as we go along. Central to this, of course, is gathering the experience from all of the stakeholders that participate, and that's what we've been doing. We have pretty much monthly meetings to discuss the latest changes and desired changes to the scheme. And that takes basically into consideration the feedback that we're receiving from the participating stakeholders. And of course, also not just based on what we've already witnessed, but of course what we recognise needs to happen to improve the scheme as well. So that's just to illustrate the fact that the scheme is living. As I mentioned, we're on our third release, the fourth one, due to be published in the next few weeks. There are 4 documents that are key to describing NESAS. These are available on our public website, which is gsma.com/NESAS. And the 4 documents are FS13, which is a general description of the scheme, FS14, which defines how the test labs are accredited, FS15 defines the audit methodology for the assessment to be done by the auditors to assess compliance with the product development and lifecycle management security requirements. And then FS16 defines those security requirements that the vendor must meet and against which the audits are conducted. So these are the 4 key documents that currently exist. We'll see later on that these are constantly updated, and also we're adding to the document list as well. In terms of auditor appointment, the GSMA defined the eligibility and competency criteria that the auditing companies must satisfy. We ran a competitive open tender process to select the auditors, and we selected 2. So the auditing organisations that currently undertake the work are ATSEC and NCC Group. And the plan basically is that we will rerun these selection processes periodically. The next one will be run next year, and of course any auditing company that feels they have and satisfy the eligibility criteria is welcome to participate in that tender process. So 2 auditing companies, ATSEC and NCC Group. In terms of vendor development process audits, a number have been conducted to date. Again, there's a full list here at the web link provided. But in summary, Ericsson has had 3 of its development processes audited, as has Huawei and Nokia, so 3 each for each of those vendors. Samsung has had 2 processes audited, and ZT has had 1 process audit. It's important to say at this point that some companies will have multiple development processes, and each one is treated distinctly and is audited distinctly and separately. And so that's why you see that some of these companies have multiple processes already audited and some perhaps not, because it may be the case that there is one standard process in use within individual vendors, whereas others, because of the nature of how the company's evolved, for example, through perhaps a series of acquisitions and mergers over the years, and that they have inherited a number of different development processes. But right now, we have had 12 vendor development processes audited, and I know that there are a number of additional audits scheduled over the next 2 to 3 months. But you can keep up to date with the current processes on our website. In terms of test labs, we have 7 accredited test labs at the moment. So ATSEC, which is one of the auditing companies, that is also an accredited test lab, as is Brightsight, DECRA, Huawei, and Palindrome Technologies in the US. And CAICT actually has 2 accredited test labs at the moment. So that's why the number is 7, but you only see 6 logos here. And again, there's a full list of the competent test labs available on our website, and we will continue to add to this. I think there are probably another 13 test labs that have indicated their intent to become accredited by their national accreditation bodies as well. In terms of product evaluations, I appreciate this slide is not particularly helpful because of the font size, but it's just to illustrate the fact that quite a number of products have already been evaluated under the scheme, 35 in total. And again, there's a full list of all of the product evaluations that have been completed on our website. And so it provides you with the name of the vendor, the network product, and the product version and release, because each evaluation is specific to each product release. So each time there's a new product release, it is necessary to conduct a new or fresh product evaluation. So again, full details of all the products available on our website. In terms of NESAS documentation, I previously mentioned that we have 4 documents already, FS 13, 14, 15, and 16, and they're going through an update at the moment for release 2.1. But we're also working on two new documents, FS46, which are the NESAS audit guidelines. This document is basically designed to provide guidance for participating vendors on what the auditors expect to see in terms of evidence of compliance with the security requirements. And FS47 is a new document that again sets out procedures for the product and evidence evaluations that are conducted by the test labs. Again, all of our documentation is available on the website. FS46 and 47, they're not currently up there because they are still going through the approval process, but they will be there in the next few weeks. So moving along, NESAS benefits. Why are we doing this? How is this going to benefit anybody? But essentially what we've done is we have looked at the benefits from two sides. First of all, how NESAS benefits industry. Bearing in mind this is an industry initiative, and we've been working on NESAS for a number of years now. It predates, to be honest, the nation state and government interest in supply chain security. So this was a scheme devised by the industry for the industry, recognizing the industry needs. But the point is that it provides a reference point for security assurance requirements for all participating stakeholders, whether it's a vendor or their customers, the network operators. The idea is to remove duplication of work, particularly for the vendors, where typically they would have to respond to detailed questionnaires, security questionnaires, as part of requests for proposal processes from the operator community. And a lot of those questionnaires are designed by individual operators, so they vary. So it can be quite time consuming for the vendors to support this work. With NESAS, it makes it quite simple because all of the network operators have to do is to ask a simple question, which is, are your development processes compliant with the security requirements defined by GSMA under NESAS, and have your network products been security evaluated by competent test labs? So it does away with quite detailed security questionnaires. And of course, the network operator is free to request copies of the audit reports and the product evaluation reports from the vendor as part of the RFP process. What we're also seeking to do, of course, is benefit the industry by providing a level of security assurance for network equipment, and to make sure that that level of assurance is visible and it's fully understood by everybody. And as I mentioned, there are copies of the audit reports and evaluation reports available to individual network operators who are sourcing equipment from their vendors. Ultimately, of course, the idea here is, in defining these security requirements, is to encourage a culture of security by design, and that's across the entire vendor community. The other benefit, of course, for the vendors, particularly those that do security quite well and that do product development security quite well, is that it affords them an opportunity to demonstrate their ability to maintain and achieve high security levels. And ultimately, the cost of all of this is shared amongst the vendors and therefore across all operators, so it's cost efficient. So what about the benefits for nation states, bearing in mind that nation states clearly are a critical stakeholder in all of this as well? Well, in most cases, we would be satisfied that the security requirements that we have defined are commensurate with national security requirements, particularly where regulations apply to critical national infrastructure. The other benefit for nation states, of course, is that the cost of this particular security assurance scheme is covered by industry, so no need for nation state funding. NESAS itself is designed to be a global scheme, so therefore it's a single scheme that is universally applicable. There really is no barrier for innovation or entering markets. It is, as I mentioned already, cost effective, and it has already demonstrated to us an ability to deliver security gains. Also, while NESAS doesn't currently contain a certification component, which I'll come back to shortly, it does interface well with certification programs. And in fact, we're currently working with NESA and the European Commission on the 5G security assurance scheme for Europe, which will contain a certification component. We have put forward NESAS as a candidate scheme, and we've demonstrated how the certification component can be added on top of NESAS as it currently exists. And ultimately, the idea is that NESAS, as I mentioned already, is designed to be enhanced as we need to. So if nation states, for example, have specific requirements that are not currently covered within the scheme, please let us know, and we'll ensure that those requirements do get added. So in conclusion, it's probably useful at this point just to wrap up in terms of what NESAS is and maybe what NESAS isn't. So as I said already at the outset, NESAS is designed to provide a baseline security level for network functions that are defined by 3GPP. It does evolve, it has evolved, and will continue to evolve as we strengthen the scheme. It's flexible in the sense that it gives the network equipment vendors choice in terms of who performs the audits of their development processes and who they use to have product evaluations conducted within the test labs. And all of this activity is monitored by an oversight board, and that's to ensure that we're taking on board feedback from all of the various stakeholders and to ensure that the industry needs are met and indeed nation state and national security interests are satisfied as well. So what is it not? Well, NESAS, like any assurance scheme, doesn't provide a guarantee that a product is free from vulnerabilities. What it does do is it provides an evaluation report that assesses and at least records the assessment of the test lab as to the compliance of that particular product against the security requirements defined by 3GPP. NESAS does not obviously provide a solution for end-to-end security assurance. It's not designed to do that. It's very much product focused. It doesn't cover network deployment, configuration, and so forth. I mentioned that earlier, that the focus is very much on the vendor element of this, not on the actual operation of the network by the network operators themselves. Neither is it a replacement for security requirements that may be defined by individual operators or indeed nation states. So we recognize the fact that this is complementary. Ideally, we would like to capture all of the security requirements that operators and nation states have within NESAS, but we recognize that there may be some specific security requirements that are not covered by the scheme. They will be. If we're informed of what they are, we can always include them. But it's not designed to replace national security efforts or the needs of individual network operators either. And finally, as I mentioned, NESAS is not a certification scheme, so we do not issue a certificate to say that a particular development process is secure or indeed that a particular product is secure. But what we do produce and what the output from NESAS is an audit report which nation states and network operators can request from the vendors, and they can then make an informed judgment as to the level of security that's deployed by that particular network vendor by reading the audit report or the evaluation report that applies to the product. But we do not issue a certificate. Now, that is something we will be looking at going forward, but currently there is no certification. So finally, what can we all do to ensure that NESAS is successful? Well, firstly, network operators should require their equipment vendors to participate in NESAS by having their development processes audited and by having their products evaluated by the test labs. So network operators can do this. They're the customer. They can include in their RFP documentation, for example, a requirement that vendors and the products they provide must be covered by NESAS. The equipment vendors themselves can support the scheme and ensure it's successful by participating and ensuring that they subject their processes to the independent audit and their products to product evaluations by the test labs. Test labs themselves that are interested in candidate test labs should be ISO 17025 accredited, also meet the additional NESAS requirements, and let us know if they have been considered competent by their national accreditation bodies, in which case we will then list those test labs as competent to perform product evaluations on our website. And finally, the ISO IEC 17025 national accreditation bodies, they can also assist the scheme by ensuring that they understand the competency requirements that we have defined that test labs must meet and be able to assess that level of compliance with those requirements. So all working together, the network operators, the equipment vendors, the test labs, and the accreditation bodies, we can ensure that this scheme continues to succeed and to thrive. And that's what we're hoping for. And that is pretty much it from me. I would like to thank you for your time this morning and your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody may have. Thank you.